Okay, got it. Okay.
I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Maddie or Elton. I don't know which one wants to start off this presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, China. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Good. Well, good morning or good afternoon to where everyone may be. My name is Elton Noswood. I'm an independent consultant and a TwoSpirit advocate, and have worked in the public health field for many years. I don't want to count, but it's over 10 years. So I'm really excited to be here to be able to present, and given this opportunity to co-present with Maddie Jim, who is a friend and a colleague of mine, and we have presented several times to agencies around working with TwoSpirit and LGBTQ individuals, as well as with the community. So we're really excited to be here today to offer you some information, some education, but also talking about our own personal experiences as individuals who identify from this community. But before I begin and before I turn it over to Maddie to introduce herself, I'm going to formally introduce myself as well. Yat e sheya Elton Noswood in Shia, Tohan and Shlintaba Bashishin, Nakaidane Ada Shiche, Tetnazani Ada Shanale, the Yadine and Shlint. What I said is, hello, my name is Elton Noswood. I'm of the Near to the Water clan, born for the Edgewater clan. My maternal grandfather's clan's of the Mexican people, and my paternal grandfather's clan is of the Tango people. This is how I identify as Navajo. I was taught at a young age to introduce myself in that way when I'm speaking to individuals, so we can make our connections, particularly as Native people, through either our tribal relationships or our clanship relationships. So I wanted to go ahead and identify myself in that way. I am currently in Denver, Colorado, on the original homelands of the Cheyenne Arapaho people. It's a beautiful day outside. We do see some clouds coming in, so hopefully we'll get some moisture as well. So really excited to be here. I'm originally from Whitehorse Lake, New Mexico, on the Navajo Reservation, and grew up in Window Rock, Arizona area as well. So very happy to be here. Maddie, you want to go ahead?
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon on the East Coast. Good morning on this side of the coast. She Maddie Jim and she nash ejidanen shlon kia ani bashichin tobahan dashchedot sanajini dashanala 8 out the nenshla. Hi, everyone. I'm Maddie Jim. I'm of the Zuni people clan, born for the Towering House people clan. So hello to those relatives who are watching or who are on here that I may be related to. I am in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I am on the Tewa people's land, and I have been doing HIV prevention, transgender advocacy for over 20 years. So like Alton said, we've known each other for a while and have done several presentations around these topics.
And I'm on mute, sorry. That's the infamous saying the last couple of years. So thank you, Maddie, for introducing yourself. And as mentioned by China, we will be taking questions at the end of the session, so feel free to use the chat box, and China will help to facilitate that as well. So thank you. So this workshop or this webinar is Mending the Rainbow, addressing IPV violence and working with the Native LGBT TwoSpirit community. So some of the learning objectives that we have for this section is to explain the LGBTQ, TwoSpirit, and transgender identities, explain how Native culture interacts with TwoSpirit LGBTQ identities, discuss intimate partner violence and myths, and then discuss some barriers and challenges for TwoSpirit LGBTQ victims. And then at the end, we are going to be providing you with some strategies as well as some resources that will assist you in the work that you're doing to better serve our community.
Oh my God.
Okay, just a reminder for everyone, please keep your microphones on mute so we don't disturb the presentation. And I kind of feel like I'm acting like the wizard now because I can mute you too. I was made the host, but just letting everyone know that, so thank you. So these are the learning objectives and hopefully we'll be able to achieve them by the end of this session. So I'm gonna present kind of the first part during this presentation. And this section is really gonna be based upon talking about what LGBTQ stands for in terms of acronyms and understanding identities for individuals who identify this way. And then I'll talk a little bit about the TwoSpirit term as well. So the L stands for lesbian, which is a woman whose enduring physical, romantic, and emotional and spiritual attraction is to other women. Gay is a man whose enduring physical, romantic, emotional, and or spiritual attraction is to other men. Bisexual is an individual who is physically, romantically, emotionally, and spiritually attracted to both men and women. And then the Q stands for queer, which is an inclusive term which collectively refers to lesbian, gay men, and transgender folks and others who may not identify with any of the categories listed as well. Before this term, was derogatory and it's generational. So there were some, LGBT individuals who may not identify with this term, but then also more of the younger generation is embracing this term in a positive way to kind of show their pride in who they are. So that was the acronym for Q. And then sometimes people also say Q stands for questioning. And questioning is one of those terms that people aren't too familiar with who they are just yet, or maybe struggling with it, so they may identify as questioning as well. But predominantly the Q stands for queer. And then TwoSpirits. I know we have a little chat function of raising your hand. I'm not sure if we're able to see that, but how many of you have heard the term TwoSpirit? No, there's some of you that may have not heard the term. Okay, well, a majority of us may have heard the term, but I'm gonna go over it as well. So TwoSpirit is a contemporary term that is used now by Native people who identify as LGBTQ individuals as well. It has a traditional and a cultural understanding primarily based around gender and gender roles and identity, right? So the term is primarily based on an individual's gender identity. It's a term that refers to Native people, Native American or Alaska Native people who also identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. As well, the term comes from the Anishinaabe language, meaning to have both a male and a female spirit within one's body, within one's spiritual understanding of themselves. And it can mean different, it can have different meanings in different tribal communities as well. So when we say the word TwoSpirit, it's actually translated into English, right? Into the English language, TwoSpirit. But when we translate TwoSpirit back into some of our traditional languages, it could totally have a different meaning other than that of the Anishinaabe, right? An example being, like in Navajo, when we translate TwoSpirit into the Navajo language and into the Navajo thought understanding, it would mean to have a good spirit and an evil spirit. So most Navajo LGBT individuals don't identify with this term because when it's translated into our cultural understanding, it would totally mean something different. So you have a lot of my Navajo relatives who don't identify by using this term, but I'll go in a little bit more about identification as well. So this term was adopted in the 1990s at the International TwoSpirit, the third international gathering in Canada. And there are a number of progressive LGBT advocates that were there, and they began to have a discussion about adopting a term that was specifically for ourselves, and it wasn't imposed on us like gay, lesbian, or even birdash, which was a term used by anthropologists early on when they made contact with us And that term actually is a derogatory term. It means to be a ket boy or a male whore. It's actually a French term that European anthropologists use. So we didn't want to be identified that way. So, you know, the group came upon this and adopted this term TwoSpirit in the 1990s. And it's been a positive term. It's been a self-identifying term, but being almost 20 to 30 years since this term was being adopted, there is some discussion in our Native LGBT TwoSpirit community to kind of revisit the term and define it a little bit more, because we've changed as a society, you know, that the meaning may be a little bit different as well. So hopefully we'll have those conversations with our community soon. TwoSpirit is not a term that can be used by non-Native LGBT people. So I often, you know, when I present, when I'm presenting to non-natives or non-native relatives, I'll have people come up and say, oh, I'm TwoSpirit too, meaning that they're LGBTQ. But I'll be like, okay, well, that's great, but are you Native? And most times they'll say no. I was like, well, you can't use that term. You're appropriating that term because that term's for us. And beyond just utilizing the terms, there are some responsibilities that come with utilizing the TwoSpirit terms, your cultural responsibilities. So even some Native people who are LGBTQ may not also use the term too, because they're not ready for those cultural responsibilities as well. And I'll talk about those a little bit more. And then I did mention that the term is not used or adopted by all tribes, just because the meaning can mean something totally different when it's in a thought process or cultural understandings for some tribes as well. So it's not used by all tribes. So hence, I often say the term is a self-identifying term, meaning allow people to identify that way for themselves. Don't just assume that all Native LGBTQ people are TwoSpirit, because some people may get offended or may not agree with it. So just allow people, to identify as TwoSpirit as well. That's usually what I say to people. The TwoSpirit terms is used in many rural and urban Native communities to describe, again, the claiming of our identities and traditional culture roles. Some examples that we see in our communities that are still practiced today in terms of some of the roles and responsibilities that I talked about. An example is being among the Lakota people. They utilize the term Wink Day to identify Native LGBT TwoSpirit people, but they also, as a part of the culture, the TwoSpirit the Wink Day play a critical role in what was described to me as part of the Lakota naming ceremony, where, culturally and traditionally, Lakota people would seek out the Wink Day to participate in the naming ceremony and give the Lakota name to the newborn person. I was told that this is still practiced today. I had a friend who gave a name, and it's considered to be a sacred honor in a way. And so he was able to share that with me. And I thought that was beautiful that we still practice those ways. And then for many tribes, it's through our oral tradition, through Native people. When we're colonized, everything's documented. And, this European worldview is very different than what we actually did practice here prior to colonization. And a majority of the practices included TwoSpirit people, right? And so it was through oral traditions that we learned about our TwoSpirit people, because it was passed down by generations, not necessarily from anthropologists and people writing it down, right? So there's a really difference in the way we honor and know our history. And so as a part of the oral tradition, and this was something I learned myself personally in my own culture, was the Navajo creation story. And there was a specific story talking about the separation of sexes. And I was told this by my older aunt, who kind of plays the grandmother role, about it. And it, after hearing this story, it really helped me as an individual kind of view myself in a different way, in a more positive way of being a Nugli person, a gay male. But as a part of the story, which I'm going to say very quickly, because the story our stories in our culture can be very elaborate. I've been told by Navajo people that some of our stories can go on for 4 nights. So this really brief, abridged version of the separation of sexes kind of goes, men and women lived together and they had a disagreement. The women got upset with the men and said, oh, we don't need to live with you. Go live across the river. We can be on our own. You know, Native women, very strong and resilient. And so they kind of, like they would say, they chased the men across the river. Hey. And so they lived that way for a number of years. And then they realized that they couldn't live like that they had to come together. So it was the less dominant, more feminine males, the Nugle, that negotiated with the men and said, hey, we have to go back over and live with our people because we need to procreate. So we need to resolve these issues together, you know. And, you know, there's more to the story, but basically it was the Nugle who went and brought the sexes together. And so that role, that responsibility of negotiation kind of is still instilled in us today. Like myself, I see myself as a negotiator in my family. Like if a problem comes up, everyone calls me and says, Elton, you know, so-and-so's doing this, what advice can you give? So my family kind of looks at me to give that, you know, to do that role of being a negotiator. So I kind of identify in that way as that's my role as a Nugle, you know, a gay Navajo person, a Two-Spirit person as well. So that was just a story that I wanted to share. But after we were contacted by the Europeans, that's when homophobia, transphobia, acculturated worldviews of gender and sexuality were really adopted. You know, it really changed the way we viewed our own people, our relatives. And then, you know, there's a whole nother issue about organized religion, but I won't really go into that. And I think we kind of all know kind of how that worked and how that affected our communities as well. I often tell people when we're doing an in-person training, you know, do you know a word for Two-Spirit Native LGBT people in your language? Would you like to share that? So if you want to share it in the chat, please do so. Because to me, language is powerful. If we didn't have a tribal language for individuals who identified this way, then they must have never existed. But for tribes that do have a word, we know that we existed because there's a name for us. There was a place for us in our communities. And that was more of a cultural understanding. So the words in our cultures validate that, validate our existence, validate our place in our own tribal communities. So these are just a few words that I listed and have heard of some of the tribal languages being used to identify Native LGBT Two-Spirit people. So the Crow have the term bote that they utilize for individuals who may be more male gendered and Two-Spirit. The Navajo, as I mentioned, I use the term Nugle. So that is more for individuals who have a gender of male and female. We also have a deity called a San Nugle, which is changing woman. So there are some understandings with our deity as well. The Lakota, as I mentioned, use the term Winkte. The Zuni have a term that they use as Lemana, and for both of those are more gender Two-Spirit people. And then the Tongva, which is a tribe in California where I used to live for a while, they shared with me terms that they had. And the term that they have is Wewa Akin, which is for more of a Two-Spirit male and female gender person. And then they had a term Kuya, which was actually for a transgender individual, transgender woman who would identify as transgender today. But the Tongva language, and the reason I include that in the presentation is because that's the first tribal language that I've heard that specifically had a term for a transgender person in a tribal community. And I think that's really significant, only because, as I mentioned before, if we had a term for someone, then we were a part of the community. We existed, right? So that was really eye-opening for me to know that they had a specific word for a transgender individual. And then just briefly, you know, we want to contextualize our own understanding of gender worldviews. And so we developed this slide, actually Maddie and I developed this slide from our conversations and understandings of our own lives, but others who identify as Native LGBT Two-Spirit. But in the Western American kind of perspective, when we're looking at gender worldviews, it's very linear. You know, like you see the arrows there, they're very left to right, right to left, very straight, for the lack of a better term, no pun intended. But it's a very, very linear. It's either and or but. right? So when we're born, our sex at birth, anatomically, we're either seen as a man or a woman, male or female. And then our gender expression, our gender identity is again then defined after we're born in terms of female to male. In American society, when we go to parties, right, or babies' parties, we always buy two certain colors. We either buy blue or pink, right? Because the American thoughts is very binary, you know, very two. Gender expression, the way people express themselves, the way they appear is more seen as masculine, feminine, right? If you're a male, you wear pants. If you're a female, you wear a dress. And, you know, there's no, you can't do in between. And then sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, you know, is also seen as kind of more binary. You're either attracted to men or you're attracted to women, you know. But in the Native understanding, the Native concept, it's more circular. It's more, you know, it weaves back and forth. It's not very linear. It's very fluid, if you will. And you'll hear the term fluidity too. So our sex at birth, you know, we're either born male or female, but our identity, our second identity is actually who we are as Native people. Do we identify, how we identify as Native people? So, you know, our second identity that's really important to us would be really about I'm Navajo, or I'm Lakota, you know, or I'm Cherokee. That would be really essential to them. And then after that, another identity would be more about gender expression. Do you express yourself more feminine or masculine? You know, and traditionally, you know, identities change. Men wore skirts, you know, women wore pants, if you will, you know, and we'll give an example of that. And then the most important that conceptualizes our worldview is more about our gender roles. What is our responsibility to our community, to our family, to our clanships, to our tribes, right? And so there's caregivers, cooks, healers, that would be considered more feminine, and then provider, hunter, healer would be considered more masculine. But in Native communities, when we think about, or at least me as a Two-Spirit LGBT person, I see myself fluid in all of this on the right, you know, under the Native community. You know, I was born a male, I am Navajo, but my expressions can change depending, you know, depending if it's ceremony, you know, depending if it's going into a sweat lodge. Can I wear a skirt? You know, and in our community, we're having those serious discussions and what we're calling skirt shaming. So there are some Two-Spirit people who are not allowed into certain sweat lodges per se, because they won't wear a skirt based upon their gender identity or what people perceive to be. So a lot of Native LGBT people aren't accessing those services. So one suggestion I'm gonna point out here, and we'll talk about later again, is that service providers, make sure when you're referring individuals to cultural services or cultural spiritual providers, that they know and they understand that they're working with Two-Spirit Native LGBT people. Because if they don't, and someone goes into a ceremony and doesn't want to wear a dress and may identify more gender queer, and they're not allowed into the ceremony, you're re-traumatizing them.
This probably has.
You know, and can we please keep our microphones on mute, please? Thank you. So that's just an example. But again, going back to this worldview, giving another example of myself in terms of gender roles, when I go back to the reservation, particularly in the summer times, and we're having our ceremonies, you'll see a lot of Two-Spirit Native LGBT individuals helping at ceremonies, primarily in the cooking area, right? But for me, as a Nugle Native gay male, when I go home, I go, you know, you'll see me cooking, then you'll see me chopping wood, hauling water, you know, and you'll see me helping the women. But in that ceremonial space, we're seeing, you know, it's accepted. It's okay. You'll see people like me doing that, and nobody would say anything, you know? So to me, that validates my role and responsibilities when I go into ceremony. This is what is expected of me as a Two-Spirit person, right? You know, and so, you know, so we wanted to share this slide just so you kind of get the view about what Western perspectives are and Native perspectives, particularly on gender, particularly for Native LGBT Two-Spirit individuals as well. And then these are just some examples of some historical Two-Spirit people that again, for me, not necessarily validate, but shows that we have people who lived in our communities that identified as well as, you know, as someone who's Native LGBT or Two-Spirit. So we had Wewa, who was from the Zuni Pueblo. Wewa would be someone we'd considered now as a transgender person. Wewa was a cultural ambassador and a caretaker. Those were her gender roles. She presented as female, wore traditional regalia, as you can see in that picture, was very well respected in her community, was also kind of a leader and got to go to Washington, D.C. at one time and met with the First Lady under President Coolidge. And at the time, no one knew she was a transgender person, but she fulfilled that role in the Zuni Pueblo. And for some of you who are familiar with some of the Pueblo tribes in the Southwest, they're very cultural. They're very, they don't talk about things to other tribes. They keep things very within their Pueblo. Even their ceremonies, sometimes they don't allow people in and other natives in. So it's very interesting to know that they were public about an individual like Wewa, you know, in the world that she served, you know, and she's very well revered still in the Pueblo. So I wanted to share a little bit about her. And then we had Oshtish, who was from the Crow tribe. Her Indian name, if you will, was finds them and kills them. Oshtish was somebody we may consider as a lesbian, more masculine female, but Oshtish played more like a warrior woman role, was very skilled, was very good with horses, you know, that was told about her, you know, and, you know, again, very well respected amongst the Crow. And if you all know the Crow, they're, you know, they love their horses. So to be someone who's excellent at being able to train and utilize horses in that way, you know, is a really great trait for the tribe. And then Hosteen Claw, probably one of my relatives, is a Navajo weaver and traditional healer. Hosteen Claw wove Navajo rugs, which were primarily a female role, but was given the ability to, you know, to weave, and then also given the responsibility to weave certain rugs of our deities. And so some of his rugs are in the Wheelwright Museum, the Smithsonian, well-respected rug weaver, but it was also considered very rich on Navajo because he had a lot of livestock. And some stories talk about him having real good trader friends, non-Navajo trader friends that he would trade with. And I'm saying friends, quote unquote, meaning that there may have been some relationships that he may have had with some of those traders on the res. So that's why I said I'm probably related to him. No, I'm just kidding. So these are just some examples that I wanted to share just to give you a glimpse that, you know, people who were Two-Spirit LGBTQ were part of our history, you know, existed in our communities, and we need to be able to acknowledge that. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Maddie, and Maddie will go ahead and talk about a little bit about transgender definitions, identity, and some of the issues facing this particular community.
Yes, thank you, Alton. So we are transitioning to a different population, and I myself am from this population. I identify as a transgender individual. So transgender is an umbrella term for persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. So some of the definitions of gender identity under this umbrella are like transgender, genderqueer, trans women, trans men, non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender variant, gender fluid. Those are some of the gender identities that are used most often. And we see more of transgender or trans women, trans men, and non-binary within some of the identifiers. We're seeing a lot more youth and people identifying with the non-binary concept. So our society is more of looking at binary, meaning like male and female. And so with somebody who identifies as non-binary, they're not conforming to like male or female. So they're just who they are. So they're non-binary, and that's how they identify. For me, as a trans woman, I identify as a trans woman because I have transitioned to what I felt that I was the opposite of. Like I was born male, so I'm living as a woman now, 24/7. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in some of the slides that are going to follow this. So these are some of the identities under the trans umbrella that people use. And there are going to be new terms that are coming about. So as we go along, I remember in the late 90s is when I heard the word transgender and closely identified with that. So that's what I identified at first, was a transgender person. So after that term, there have been many identities that have grown within the 20 years that I've been doing advocacy to have these different gender identities under that umbrella. So it's a self-identifying term also too. So individually, somebody can identify in different ways. Another term that I had seen when I was young at age 14 was transsexual. So that's when I used the Dewey Decimal System to look for the word transsexual, and had to research that, and found that I didn't identify as a transsexual because surgery I don't think was a part of what my plans were going to be. So not identifying as transsexual. So I had identified as gay when I first came out to my mother and to the community, but embraced the word transgender in the late 90s when that came out also too. So just a little information about that, and then also maybe my experience from that. The next slide. So our next slide is the 4 basic concepts of identity. So all of us in here in the Zoom call can utilize these 4 basic concepts of identity and how we identify ourselves. So the first one is your sex assigned at birth, what you were born. So a lot of times we think binary, meaning you were born male or female. And oftentimes we forget to include intersex population. So we do have people who are born intersex. So being born with ambiguous genitalia. And when we talk about intersex, a lot of times people think they're actually born with both genitalia, but it's ambiguous. So with ambiguous genitalia, there could be different different concepts within that, and not just having necessarily the genitalia, but looking at the chromosomes, looking at what could be inside the body that's not showing on the outside. So there could be that mixture. So a lot of times when we talk about sex assigned at birth, we go through the binary system and just create a box for male and female, but not give an opportunity for intersex people to identify in that sense. Gender identity, how one identifies. I just gave some examples of gender identity, identifying as either male or female, transgender, trans woman, trans man, gender queer, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and stuff. So that's gender identity. Gender expressions, how you express yourself, how you dress, how you carry yourself, how you express yourself to the world, basically. So it depends on what you wear, how you present yourself with whoever you're with, and how you express yourself in a different sense. Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. So you could be attracted to men, you could be attracted to women, you could be attracted to both, you could be attracted to all. So there's different definitions under the sexual orientation box also too. So those are the 4 basic concepts of identity when we identify ourselves. So the next slide that we're going to see is actually an activity that we do with people when we do a training. And this whole circular identity we developed, we looked at the linear model that Elton had used earlier in the slides that he was talking about. We thought that was very linear. So when this was being developed, we talked about how this could be incorporated with all populations, even with Native populations, because I feel that we're more of that circular identity and how one transforms. So if we were to do an activity and we were to give a dot to each person, all of us in this phone call, in this Zoom call, would have different places where we place our dots. Like for me, for example, my sex assigned at birth is male. So I would be more towards the male spectrum. My gender identity is trans woman. So it would be between female and both in the upper spectrum, somewhere, right about there. And then my gender expression is totally female. So I live as a woman, I dress as a woman, I present myself as a woman, live 24/7 as a woman. So that's how I express myself. And then when it comes to my sexual orientation, sometimes people get stumped because I identify as a heterosexual transgender woman, meaning that I am attracted to heterosexual men. And a lot of times people get confused because of what they may have learned or what they may have read or been taught about. And I tell people one thing in trainings is that always think about what's between my ears and not what's between my legs. And because I was born male and I still have my genitalia and my partner has male parts, people assume that I am gay. So I'm not gay. I'm not attracted to gay men. I'm attracted to heterosexual men. So it may sound a little bit confusing, so I'll let you process that. So when we're sexually attracted to somebody, like I said, it could be gay, it could be bi, it could be lesbian, it could be asexual, it could be pansexual. And transgender is actually not under a sexual orientation. Transgender is actually a gender identity. So a transgender person can be gay, they can be bi, they can be lesbian, they can be pansexual, or they can be asexual. So just to give you that definition, because a lot of times when we get to this component, a lot of times it causes some confusion, but I think asking questions and learning a little bit more about populations, especially within trans communities, can help. So I hope I kind of explained that a little bit more in depth. And if you have more questions, I'm open to like emailing me later on and having those conversations. But because for time's sake, we have to move on. So our next slide. So some inappropriate terms that we don't use and that we've heard, and sometimes we still hear, is the word fag, faggot, tranny, she-male, he, she. Hermaphrodite was used before for intersex populations, but we don't use that anymore. We use the term intersex. It, thing, queer for some who don't use the term, and Elton kind of explained it about how the younger generation is embracing it and being empowered. And some people may identify as queer, but as a service provider, it'd be good to find out how the person uses it. Because if somebody comes out and is happy and say, I'm queer, and this is who I am, and they're excited about it, then that's how they self-identify, and they're used as an empowering word. As for me, the older generation, almost reaching 50, I heard the word queer in a negative sense. So for me, hearing that, I kind of still have a little bit of a reminders or triggers when I hear that word unexpectedly, that where I twitch. So being traumatized by that and stuff. So as service providers, it's good to know generationally, and then also how one identifies with the word queer. Next slide. So this slide, I'm going to talk about some of the statistics that have been collected, some of the data that's been collected for our trans community. So in 2010, the first survey that was done was called Injustice at Every Turn. There were over 6,500 trans identified people who did this survey, and they named it Injustice at Every Turn because that's what they saw with social determinants of health and housing, medical care, mental health, service providers, all of that. They found evasive discrimination, so that's why they titled that. And then fast forward to 2015, and they did the survey again, and they named it the US Trans Survey 2015. And this time they got over 27,000 participants to fill out this survey. They also included non-binary, gender non-conforming populations too. And the statistics were still alarming. The statistics were still there. One of the biggest things that was alarming was seeing the 41% suicide attempt with trans populations in the survey compared to the 5% of the national average. That is huge. And that's attempted, not thought about, not had ideations, but actually attempted and survived. So as trans people, when we do trainings and give the statistic, we also tell people, like, what about those who follow through with suicide? They can't fill out surveys. So we're thinking these statistics could be a lot higher because of those who follow through with suicide. And out of that survey, they did subpopulations also too. So with American Indian, Alaska Native populations, they took the demographics who identified as American Indian, Alaska Native, and did a subcategory of that. And this is some of the statistics that were from that. And I, Trudy Jackson, another person, helped in doing these demographics for our population. So 50% of American Indian, Alaska Native transgender respondents have had negative healthcare experiences. So that, or being denied services, or having to teach our healthcare providers on who we are and within our identities. And I've done that before, going to healthcare services and them not being familiar with trans populations. Like sometimes they don't even know that I'm trans. So they ask me the questions of like, when was your last period? When was your last pregnancy test? And for me, I kind of have a little bit of fun before I identify who I am. So with that, I'm like, oh, I haven't had a period in 2 months. I might need a pregnancy test and stuff. And they're like, oh, okay. And so, no, I'm just kidding, I'm trans. And so having to give that information, we're looking at educating our healthcare providers on how to treat ourselves, which is kind of interesting. Another statistics is 37% of American Indian, Alaska Native transgender individuals did not see a doctor when needed because of fear of being mistreated. And this is far too common within our population, because we don't want to be misgendered, or we don't want to have people use the wrong pronouns. And this actually I've seen with several of my friends who tried to get help at healthcare centers. I had a friend who was going through horrible withdrawals, and I went with her to the ER to get some help. But because the way the front desk was treating her and snickering about her, she just left without getting services. So those things do happen within our population still. 49% of American Indian, Alaska Native transgender respondents who showed ID that didn't match gender were verbally harassed, denied benefits or service, asked to leave, or assaulted. So IDs, documentation is still an issue. There are some states that documentation change is a little easier than others. Within tribal communities, so because we have so many tribal communities, we do not know the name change process for each tribal community. Sometimes it could be challenging, sometimes it could be easy, we do not know. But that's one thing that I think service providers can advocate for their clients if they do have trans individuals, is to try to make it easier for identification purposes and looking at their identification. For me, New Mexico, it's a little easier. I changed my ID to match me, my gender marker and my ID, my gender marker on my birth certificate. Those were a lot easier for me compared to other states who may have a big challenge in doing that. So that's one thing to really look at. 57% of American Indian, Alaska Native transgender individuals attempted suicide. And this is just within our Native trans population. That's over half of our respondents of American Indian, Alaska Native populations who filled out the survey. And that's alarming. That's very alarming. And how do we look at mental health? How do we look at our behavioral health services, especially in tribal communities, and how we work with our trans individuals? And what services can we provide for them and to them? 65% of American Indian, Alaska Native transgender individuals reported having been sexually assaulted in their lifetime. And this is over half. And we deal with that sometimes on a daily basis. There are some transgender type people who have been kicked out of their houses, who resort to survival sex or sex work on the streets. And so a lot of times with sexual assaults, it goes unreported because of also fear, going back to the fear of being mistreated at a hospital, or the fear of being called the wrong name and stuff. So that has happened. I had a friend who was sexually assaulted, who I accompanied to the ER in the hospital, and waited 2.5 hours to try to get seen. And at that point, she was like, I don't want to wait anymore. I want to go home. And tried to encourage her to stay to get seen, but still left because of that. So what services do we have for our trans population to make it a little easier when we go through traumatic experiences? And on the right side of the slide, the provider tip, ask appropriate questions with trans clients when you're working with them. Don't ask about a transgender person's genitals unless it has to do directly with the care or treatment they are seeking from you. So if I'm coming in for a sore throat, don't ask me about my genitalia or if I had surgery, because that has nothing to do with my sore throat. When screening is appropriate, consider the following. With trans women, like prostate, breast exams, because we're taking hormones, looking at heart challenges, asking about hormonal therapy with trans men, still having like pap smears, hysterectomy, top surgery. So if we're transitioning to a different identity and looking at that, we still have some biological parts that we may not have addressed and still live with those parts. So I think being competent, especially within not just healthcare, but I think just the service providers and knowing these things. Next slide. So we're at the point where we say how to be an awesome ally and a provider to our populations of Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit people. Never deny a LGBTQ Two-Spirit person care or service because of your personal beliefs. I've come across experiences where people's personal beliefs have come into play on actually getting services. I remember going to get services one time for counseling and was told that, you know, that living your way is wrong. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So those things could happen. So as a service provider, I tell people always be client-centered and not put your personal beliefs into play. Treat LGBTQ people, Two-Spirit people with the courtesy and respect you would like to be treated with. Be sensitive that most transgender medical needs are not covered by insurance. And this is very true. So a lot of trans people who are like with Indian Health Services, a lot of times we know that with Indian Health Services, with insurance, we work with insurance first, and then Indian Health Services covers medical care after that. So because of policies that some trans people may want confirmation surgeries, and people may look at that as electives and may deny confirmation surgeries and stuff. So those things are still being addressed to this day. And how do we look at policy and changing those policies to make it easier for trans individuals to get medical necessity and healthcare? Advocate for cultural fluency. A lot of times around when we say cultural fluency, we think, oh, Native culture and being educated on that. So there's all types of cultures out there. So transgender populations being a culture of itself also too. So really learning about trans populations, maybe doing a transgender 101, or if you have advanced education on trans, maybe doing a transgender 201. So there's different types of cultural fluencies that could be done in educating. Be aware that transgender people may have a name or other information on records that may be incongruent with appearance or preferred name and pronouns. So with that, like before I transitioned with my name change and stuff, my name was Manuel, but I go by Maddie now. So dressed like this, going into a hospital in a waiting room, and they called Manuel Jim, and I were to stand up, people would automatically put two and two together and know that I was trans and stuff, and just the fear of being called names or just looked at in a different way kind of makes it very fearful. And I was like that before until I gained my confidence in who I am. So be mindful of that too, especially in waiting rooms. If you're going to call out somebody's name, if they're transgender, really look at their chart, and if they go by another name, call them by that name. Next slide. Continued, don't just add the T, meaning don't just add a transgender box, don't just add T. What we're advocating for is a two-part question where you're asked, like, what's your sex assigned at birth? It could be male, female, or intersex. The second question being, what's your gender identity? Male, female, trans woman, trans man, transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming. And they can put additional with a line on it, and somebody could check that box off. Never use the word other. I think a lot of us in our communities don't like the word other. I don't like the word other and categorize as other. So always try to put additional, maybe a line, and see how others identify themselves. So give them that option. Make your organization truly transgender inclusive, accepting, aware. Don't tokenize transgender people. For a lot of years, we've been asking people to hire trans people. If you want to work with the population, hire us, because we know how to work with our population. Become an active ally for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Two-Spirit people in your community. LGBTQ Two-Spirit people work in our settings, in our communities. How do we support them? How do we become allies and have them be a part of our community and do that? It's Gay Pride Month. So what do we do for our LGBTQ two-spirit community, especially in our tribal communities or even our agencies. Call out transphobic, homophobic remarks and jokes. We see that all the time. We still hear it in TikTok. We still see that in little memes that are created and stuff. So really looking at stuff, if you feel that it's transphobic or homophobic, or don't post it. Don't continue to try to support it by sharing it and stuff. So call people out on that. If this is a little transphobic, this is a little homophobic. And I've done that quite a few times. And it's interesting, the rebuttals or the arguments that have arose from that, and not realizing, and the only thing they say is, it's a joke. But to somebody who's of the population, it's not a joke. It may not be a joke. Resist the urge to place others in a male box or female box. Gender stereotypes suck for everyone, not just transgender people. So like I said, a possible recommendation is a two-part question. Next slide. And I believe I'm going to segue and turn it over back to Alton.
Well, thank you, Maddie, for providing that information. I think it was really important to view the transgender population a little bit separately, because your issues are more distinct and specific. And so we wanted to be able to do that more specifically, so people can understand as providers. A little bit to add to what Maddie presented was, the data is really limited for our community. When we're looking at data, victims, violence, when we're looking at health data, there's always data on Native people, Alaska Native people, and data on LGBT people, but never do we really see a lot of data that's combined for Native LGBTQ2s people. So the stats that Maddie provided, I think, really gives us an indication of what's affecting our relatives who identify as transgender. Over 50%, 67% of sexual assault. For those of us that work in the victim services field, that should be alarming to you. What are you doing to help this population? How are you inviting them to see, to feel comfortable in accessing services? So the information presented, and particularly what I'm going to present on data, broaden that understanding and really look at some of the statistics that affect our specific population, whether they're Native or non-Native statistics. But when we look at Native statistics, we got to understand that the percentages may be a little bit higher, but we really need to be able to kind of look at the data, even within your own agencies. Once you begin to change your data information sheets, collect that data for LGBT2 people, include those in your proposals. Those are important things to be able to do. Now, the beef of this presentation, and I believe we have a little bit over 30 minutes left, I'm gonna go over, and that is particularly around intimate partner violence. And so these statistics give you an understanding of how it's affecting particularly just the LGBTQ community. And then we can probably look more so about how it's affecting our Native community. But the NCAVP recorded 52 reports of hate violence and 15 reports of intimate violence in 2017. 71% were people of color, which also includes Native people. 67% of the victims were 35 years or younger. So we know that some of these statistics show that it's affecting our youth. And 52% again were transgender or gender non-conforming. So we're really seeing a high rate of violence around interpartner violence, as well as homicides amongst that community. The most common types of violence that survivors reported experience included physical violence, verbal harassment, threats and intimidation, isolation, and online harassment. I think Maddie gave some examples of that as well, particularly around online harassment, with TikToks and some of these social media platforms as well. Survivors reported experienced sexual violence had increased from 4% in 2005 to 7% in 2016. So we're seeing the sexual violence increasing slowly, but still significantly, with the annual statistics. Transgender women are two and a half times more likely to be stalked, 2.5 times more likely to experience financial violence, and 2 times more likely to experience online harassment compared to survivors who did not identify as transgender women. And these are just some general myths that we like to provide you to kind of think about, because, and kind of demystify these myths as well in the work that you're doing. But one of the main myths about LGBT two-spirit victimization is that abusers are usually bigger, stronger, and more butch than their partners. When we're talking about same gender relationships and same gender partners, it's very different for the LGBT two-spirit community, because those relationships are kind of at an equilibrium. When we look at heterosexual relationships, we oftentimes as a society think the male has more power than the female, right? That's a general misconception. But when you're looking at more same gender relationships, that dynamic is really different. They share the same commonality, maybe because they're same gender, but we got to understand that if they're bigger, if they're more masculine, they may not be the abuser. It may be vice versa. So we really need to demystify that myth. The second myth is that LGBTQ two-spirit victims can easily leave abusive partners because they have no legal ties to them, right? In hetero relationships, if you're in a, there are some consequences, but a majority of the time, LGBTQ two-spirit people, we don't have those legal, legal protections. Some tribes do, and we're seeing more tribes getting more progressive, about victimization laws, violence, and hate crime laws. More recently, I believe the Oglala Lakota Sioux passed tribal legislation to protect the LGBT two-spirit community. I believe they're one of the first or one of the few that have done that for their own tribal communities, which again goes back to this myth. If we have legal consequences, then that would help to support us as well. One of the things I also tell is if your tribe does not have any legal ordinances or laws to protect LGBT people, begin to look at your state laws, because the state laws, can be utilized in prosecuting or to helping victim survivors who are LGBTQ individuals. And usually state laws can be utilized in that regard. If no state law or if no tribal law is in existence. Myth number 3, transgender people wouldn't get hurt if they didn't dress or try to act like something they're not. Example, if he didn't dress or act like a woman, he wouldn't get hurt, right? So that's the transphobia perspective that people often have too. Like they're asking for it, because they're that way, they're asking for it. Majority of the times or all the time, we're not asking for it. We just are who we are. When we end up in these violent situations. So, we're not asking for it. So really kind of demystify these myths that we're talking about as well. Abusive behaviors particular to LGBT two-spirit violent relationships. So outing is a term that some people may have heard or not heard. It doesn't mean to go camping. It does mean to be actually where someone's gender identity or sexual orientation, you use that against them, right? And particularly in some of the same-sex relationships, some partners do that. Some partners who are not out, particularly in tribal communities, may utilize that against their abuser as well. If you don't do this, I'm gonna out you, right? Or I'm gonna tell your family. And then this also brings me to another subpopulation that I think we need to begin to talk about, which is what I call the non-identified gay men, which is kind of similar to the perspective of the down low amongst the African-American community. So at one point that became a big topic in the African-American community, which were individuals who identified as heterosexual men, but had same-sex or had sexual relationships with either men or transgender women as well. And we know we have this population in our tribal communities, and so that might be another reason of, going back to the outing part of it. But these individuals who I term non-identified gay men, they can also be put Native LGBT two-spirit individuals at more risk. Just because of how they identify and the behaviors they're participating in. Also reinforcing fears that no one will help a partner because he or she is LGBTQ, or that for some reason the partner deserves the abuse. Justifying abuse with the notion that the partner is not really LGBTQ or 2S. And also an example also could be that he or she may once have had or may still have relationships with other people or express a gender identity inconsistent with the abuser's denigration of the term, which goes back to my example of the non-identified gay men, right? They identify in a certain way, but the behaviors are different. So it's really important to know that. Continuing on, telling the partner that abusive behavior is a normal part of an LGBT two-spirit relationship, or that it cannot be domestic violence because it's occurring between two LGBT individuals. Again, that's that power dynamic, that's that understanding of, you know, who is the abuser, who is the perpetrator, and who is the victim, right? In terms of domestic violence. Because when we think of a heterosexual domestic violence, again, the male seems to always be the perpetrator, or it seemed to be, you know, against the female victim. Or when it's a same gender relationship, how do we identify those dynamics? And some of the examples given is that to continue to ask questions on who, you know, that will just assist you in figuring and understanding who is the victim in that way as well. Portraying the violence as mutual or even consensual, especially if the partners attempt to defend against it or an expression of masculinity or other desirable trait. So, you know, they may say, oh, well, they deserved it, you know, or, oh, he did this because he has muscles, per se, right? I'm still needing to meet a Native man with muscles. No, I'm joking. So, and then a common attitude about abuse in LGBTQ two-spirit relationship is that again of the power differential. Cannot be expressed because in theory, people who share the same gender have the same amount of power, quote unquote. However, in domestic violence, they flow from some type of power differential exists, whether it be economic self-sufficiency, class, oh, sorry. This thing is really sensitive. So the power differential, I'm sorry, also exists in that way. So just to let you know that, education or health status. So barriers to addressing LGBT two-spirit domestic violence. There are poor and inconsistent law enforcement responses, particularly in tribal communities. There is such a need to continuously train our law enforcement in our tribal communities. I say that because I have a brother who is a tribal law enforcement officer, and he often tells me that because he has a openly out gay brother, that everything he's learned from me, he's teaching his fellow officers, which is really kind of good in one sense, but kind of disconcerting in another sense because they're not getting that training that I think they really do need. And then there's no access to family courts. I have not necessarily seen that in tribal courts in terms of identifying same-sex relationships. There's a lack of accessibility and sensitive services, particularly in tribal communities on reservations. You know, we probably have maybe one victim services office, if any, or maybe even one person who runs the office. But generally, you know, it's not really accessible. And then just the lack of sensitivity and inclusion of LGBT two-spirit people in the services, I also think is lacking. What we've seen in tribal communities that don't have victim services or don't have specific LGBT two-spirit services available, we encourage them to maybe reach out to, you know, maybe off reservation or other agencies that may provide those services for them and build that collaboration, which could be helpful. Victims fear being outed. Again, we talked about outing, letting someone know someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Victims' hopelessness or fear of reprisal. So Maddie just mentioned that, you know, in terms of even healthcare. But you know, me, even as a victim survivor, I was a victim of a hate crime when I was in college, and I have scars on my head to prove it. And I had a major concussion because I was beaten amongst a group of heterosexual men outside a gay bar, and I was left there, and I didn't go to the hospital. I literally walked home took a shower, just all this blood coming down, and then just fainted, basically. And then people were encouraging me to go to the hospital, go to the police, and report this. And I felt like I deserved it, you know, and I felt it was me, and I never reported it. And it wasn't until I disclosed that a part of my healing was done, because I had hopelessness and I had the fear that, you know, law enforcement, IHS is going to say, oh, that's your fault. You were at a gay bar, you know. And luckily I had that support in addressing it, and have healed from it, and now can express that to other people, that it should be reported. We need to report these. When I did disclose it, I did it at a conference, and I had a number of other LGBT two-spirit individuals stand up and testify that they did the same thing. So it really validated that feeling that, you know, it's a fear, you know, nobody's gonna care for us. And then victims may not be aware of the services dedicated to the community, to LGBT two-spirit victims, because LGBT anti-violent organizations lack the resources to publicize their services widely. So that is my challenge to you, is if your agency is truly wanting to work with our relatives to be inclusive, to include that on any of your promotional flyers, put up, you know, and we'll give you know, some examples as well on how to be able to do that from an agency level. Avoid being judgmental, keep an open mind, address your own phobias and biases. We all have that. We are all human people. I know I have my own, just kidding. Navajos have the best fry bread, that's my bias. And then ask questions and be willing to learn. Recognize that LGBTQ two-spirit people are often especially vulnerable to being targets of violence. Be honest with your feelings, concerns, and wishes with the LGBTQ two-spirit community about risks that they may place themselves in. So maybe have those conversations once you build trust. Include LGBTQ two-spirit people in all aspects of community life and cultural activities. Invite them to the powwows, you know, but just make sure it's a safe environment. Assist in finding the local traditional roles that LGBT two-spirit people played or held in your community prior to European contact. That's another challenge too, is find out what was happening in your tribal communities. Where were two-spirit people as a part of your community before European contact? Find out the words that your people use to identify our two-spirit people as well. Include that in your pamphlets. It's very powerful. And you wouldn't believe if an LGBT person saw that how much they will feel about coming into your space in your agency for help as well. Speak out against homophobia, transphobia, hate crimes, jokes. Encourage and support people to share their stories of domestic violence and hate crime experience. Kind of like myself, maybe provide talking circles, because we're out there and we don't talk about it, right? And we got to be able to talk about it in order to heal. So providing that safe space and trust to be able to talk about it is important. Support LGBT two-spirit victims of domestic violence and hate crimes by listening and being empathetic. Encourage the media to report accurately on all crimes of hate, and encourage the media to use proper pronouns. I've heard media and even tribal media use the wrong pronouns when we knew the person identified in a different way. Educate young people to not tolerate violence and hate amongst anyone. Those were our traditional roles. So how can we create and mend the rainbow? Maddie, do you want to go ahead and go over this?
Yes, I sure will. So mending the rainbow, create supportive systems in your organizations or even in tribal communities to work with Native LGBTQ two-spirit people. Build trust among the community, because a lot of times Elton was talking about fear. Sometimes there's that mistrust within our communities and how they're going to treat us. So building that trust is a big way of mending that rainbow. Honor traditions and cultures. Native LGBTQ two-spirit people are a part of our cultures, our traditions, our stories, and a part of history. And we're being erased at times. So understanding and honoring that. Eliminate homophobia and transphobia. We can't say that enough. Educate services and law enforcement of special issues. Like Elton mentioned, like domestic violence, same-sex partners, tribal members, working within our communities, and law enforcement, like incarceration, how do we handle that, especially with trans populations? Identify appropriate resources. What resources are there for LGBTQ communities? What else can be done for our population in different service sectors? Reassessing protective protocols, looking at shelters, jails, hospitals, and services. So what policies are in place for our Native LGBTQ two-spirit populations? What can we do to look at the forms? Forms are a big thing. So I think somebody had mentioned just she and male and female boxes, but do we include intersex? Do we have gender identity specifically for our population? So looking at your documentation and your paperwork, even using electronic documentation stuff, looking at what programs you use. Become knowledgeable in LGBTQ state, federal, and tribal laws. Different states have different laws for LGBTQ communities. Elton mentioned some policies and laws within different tribal communities. So being aware of that and also educating yourselves on that also. Creating tribal ordinances and or policies to protect Native LGBTQ2 spirit people. Look, being involved in tribal communities and changing these policies. A lot of times when we mention policies, people are like, oh, that's the policy, it's hard to change, which it really isn't. You address it by doing a concern, form a committee, bring it to the table and saying these things are discriminating, these things are not right. How can we change this to include everybody? Address homelessness, substance use abuse, same partner violence, discrimination, hate, HIV/AIDS and STI issues, employment, adequate health care, and so on. So addressing the social determinants of health within our communities and how to make it better for all people within our communities, this including Native LGBTQ two-spirit population. And also looking at physical space recommendations, images and decor that are inclusive. One recommendation is doing a safe zone training, getting stickers to put in your windows or on your walls to show that LGBTQ populations are welcomed. And one of the new flags that's being utilized is called a progressive flag. That's not just a gay flag, but it also includes trans populations, people of color populations. And so it's called the progressive flag that people are starting to post and utilize. Two-spirit LGBTQ resources are pamphlets. So having pamphlets in your waiting area or having posters or having literature or magazines that are LGBTQ related. So just the physical sight of seeing something in that office will make it easier for somebody with the population. Produce marketing information relevant to two-spirit and LGBTQ people, language, images. Images is a big thing because as Native people, we're visual. I'm very visual. So if I see something that I relate to, I'm like, oh my gosh, they're doing this. This is fabulous. Gender neutral restrooms is a big issue. If you have a single occupancy restroom that you have identified as male or female, make them both gender neutral restrooms because it's a single occupancy restroom. And so change some of those policies also too. Hire a workforce that is congruent with the population you serve. So if you say you're serving trans populations or LGBTQ populations, do you have people on staff who identify within that population who can work with the population? So really look at that and how to be inclusive of our population. Additional provider recommendations, like we said earlier, sexual orientation, gender identity questions. Ensure intake forms are inclusive and contain appropriate sexual orientation and gender identity questions that include an option for two-spirit. So like I said, having that two-part question, the sex assigned at birth and also the gender identity option. Pronouns, using pronouns is very important. We have people who are saying, not just saying he, him, she, her, but we have people who identifies they and them, even Z and here. So there's different pronouns that are being used. So familiarizing yourselves with that or even having it on intake forms would be awesome. Ensure intake forms contain a question about preferred gender pronouns if applicable. For instance, do you prefer a certain gender pronoun? Yes or no? If so, which pronouns do you go by? Name you prefer. So if my name was still Manuel Jim, I haven't changed it, but I went by Maddie, I would put down Maddie. I want to be called Maddie. So ensure the intake form contains preferred name. If patient goes by something other than their legal name, make sure preferred name is indicated in the chart EMR and used by staff. So this is very important also too, especially with tribal communities, because I've heard like tribal employees say like, well, that's your name legally. We have to go by your name legally, which is not necessarily true. So just having that option of having a name, another name that you go by would be great, especially for a trans person.
Okay, good, Maddie. Just a couple of things to add. In terms of the option for TwoSpirit, I've recommended to people if they wanted to include TwoSpirit to also include it in the sexual orientation and gender identity. You can list them in both because people will identify as TwoSpirit in either category. Pronouns have become a contemporary issue. You know, I don't know if your agencies are going through that, but when you do introductions, sometimes they'll ask you for your pronoun preferred. I often feel too that's generational. A lot of the older folks don't tend to like to identify their pronouns in the LGBT community. Some feel it's a colonization process of letting you know. And so offer that again as a self-identifying term, as you know, and pronouns that are accepted as well. And I think that a lot of the younger people, you know, that's their way of identifying. And I think that's okay. We just need to support them, you know. So thank you, Maddie. Just wrapping up, these are some resources that we have for you that you can get more information on. They're national organizations. We've provided websites for you that you could contact them. We also have a couple of Native organizations. The Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition, SWIC, has a TwoSpirit LGBT Advisory Council, which Maddie and I serve. So we have some information there. We provide specific trainings on certain issues as well. And then also the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center has expanded their services to include our population as well. So they're a great resource as mentioned. These are just some of the summaries that we wanted to include, particularly for stats, for information, for your programs to maybe utilize for any proposals or resource fundings. We already kind of did the work for you, so you can tap into that. One of the good resources that I always promote, that's something that's out there, is the Tribal Equity Toolkit. I believe it's on its third or fourth version, but it's really enhanced a lot of the understanding, particularly for our tribal councils, our tribal governments, as well as just even generally our community. But these are some of the topics that you may find interesting in terms of victim services that they all have in their toolkit. They also have examples of how to develop policies and ordinances for protection. So it's a really good resource. And you can find that at the Graduate Lewis and Clark University website there. I provided that link. Others, the Celebrating Our Magic Toolkit, Indian Health Services helped to provide with the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board. I gotta commend Indian Health Services fairly recently. They've really been inclusive of our community, have done resources, programs, all these great stuff to be able to use. They're even doing ECHO now for LGBT individuals, trans populations, which is a virtual meeting with providers. But also if you wanna find some social marketing materials, posters, cards, all that, Northwest Portland Indian Health Board has a lot of that, so you can print those out. They're very great. I gave one to the Denver Indian Health and Family Services, framed it, now they have it in their waiting room and it's beautiful. And then the last one is the National American of American Indians has a spotlight on our community as well that could help with some policy issues for our tribal communities. And that is it. And I believe, we're 1 minute over. We have 10 more minutes for questions and answers. There is Maddie and I's email addresses if you'd like to, if you have any questions or need more resources or what have you, please feel free to email us. And I believe, China, we are ready for some questions. So thank you, Ahiat.
All right, I think we do have one question so far. If you guys have questions, feel free to put those in the chat or unmute yourself if you would like to talk. Someone says, speaker this morning did not ask preferred, but what should I call you? Or she said not to ask the preferred, but what should I call you? Liz, I don't know if you're still on, if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that question.
Yes, yes, thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you so much. The speaker this morning, Sharday, had mentioned not asking the question when I'm interviewing people, you know, what is your preferred pronoun, as though it was a choice. I believe the way that they described it was for me to ask specifically, what shall I call you? And I'm wondering if Elton and Maddie would agree with that approach, please.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, that's fine too. And it may be even situational. I mean, if it's on one-on-one when you're working with a victim survivor, then I would, you know, maybe be a little bit more comfortable in using pronouns because, you know, I think ultimately what you want to do is not mispronoun a person, you know, on your own. So just ask, would you prefer pronoun? I mean, I would still say prefer pronouns. I mean, because, you know, a lot of the generation, or younger generation too, understand that too. So I would still ask it. It's not intrusive. One of the things that I'm learning as well, and Maddie's taught me this, and I was just emotionally distraught because my Uber driver, I said, thank you, sir, and they identified as trans. And they kind of really got upset and it really bothered me the whole day. And I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't know. You know, and so I called Maddie and I was like, Maddie, I misgendered someone's pronoun, my Uber driver, I still feel bad. This was like 5 hours later. And then Maddie's response to me was like, that's okay, you apologized and now just do better.
Correct.
Right? You know, so it's a new form of identification. So, you know, if we mess up, apologize. But I would say, you know, it's, you know, all the questions we ask are self-identifying, and if it helps the victim to identify, then I would definitely suggest that.
And I think to add to that also too, like Elton said, it's situational. And a lot of times when you get somebody who gets upset and mad about it and continues that, you have to also realize what they've gone through for so many years. So many years of oppression, discrimination, hate, violence, being told ugly things. That could be part of that lashing back also too. So as trainers, we have people who profusely apologize, but apologize and move on and just work on not doing it again. And then with pronouns, like what pronoun do you go by? Is there a pronoun that you go by? Is there another name you go by? Is there a different name you go by? And I think just asking those questions in a nice manner instead of what name do you go by or what other, like you can tell. So body language and the way you present also could be part of that. If you're calmly asking a question around pronouns or names, the response I think you're gonna get back is what you would want to.
Yeah, I'm also doing it now. I'm seeing children now, obviously through telehealth from, you know, all over the country, which has been a wonderful positive side effect of, if you will, of COVID. You know, I can actually reach out to more Mohegan children, and I'm thrilled for that opportunity. And I've also said to some of those kids, I just want to get it right this time. You know, I just want to get it right. I don't want to screw this up. So bear with me, you know, and I do it with a smile and a welcoming and, you know, please understand that I want to get this right. And I'm learning, and I appreciate an opportunity for you to help teach me.
Yeah.
It's kind of how I couch it.
I think one of the things that also too is like when we start saying preferred pronoun or preferred name, that within when we do trans training, trans 101 trainings, that we stay away from the word prefer. Like and the way I asked it, like what other pronouns do you go by? What pronoun do you go by? Just asking it direct instead of saying preferred. Yeah.
Correct.
So be creative in the way you ask things.
Thank you.
And thank you for that question. You know, I think that's a great way, you know, and you're being a good relative. And that's ultimately what we want to be able to do is being that good relative. How can I be better? How can I support you? So definitely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question?
Not seeing any in the chat box, but feel free to type it in. We have a few more minutes.
And just a little bit back to the pronoun, like I use he, him, his primarily, but again, it's situational. Like I do drag. So when I'm in drag, I go by she, they, you know, and then when I'm amongst friends, other gay friends, we primarily use she terms just amongst ourselves as slang, you know? And so it's, again, it's really situational on how we use those. But just being respectful. And then I have older Two-Spirit friends too that are just so against it. Like, I don't use pronouns, and that's okay too. That's okay too. And I had a Navajo friend actually use traditional words on pronouns, like kind of changing the narrative, like indigenizing it. So they would say, I use she, ne, be, which are cultural pronouns in our language. So, and it wasn't based on gender, which is interesting. So. Any other questions, comments? I know it was a lot of information, so hopefully everyone got a glimpse into understanding Native LGBTQ individuals. And if you've kind of heard me and Maddie as well, we use the whole acronym and then Two-Spirit, because again, we want to be inclusive and people can self-identify the way they want to. And we're trying to do nationally a movement where we're wanting to add the 2S into those acronyms. Add to the alphabet. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, I don't see any extra questions coming in, but I do want to thank you guys. That was a really wonderful presentation. I personally learned so much, and I just think it's a really important topic. So we really appreciate your time today. I did want to remind everyone to sign out if you are trying to get your CEUs. I'm going to put it in the chat box just so you can access it a little bit easier. Don't forget to sign out or else you won't get your CEUs. And then fill out the evaluation form because it's really helpful for us. So thank you guys again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Okay, thank you again. Continue to be good relatives. Thank you for all your work and for being at this presentation.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Elton, are we staying?